Welcome everyone to the last session for today, but the first plenary session for the conference. And I was saying that SeNSS has the pleasure and the honor to have its first plenary address for this conference by Professor Diane Elson, who's an emeritus professor at the Department of Sociology at the University of Essex. She is the chair of UK's Women's Budget Group, which is a voluntary network of researchers, trade unionists, feminist activists that analyzes the impact of UK government budget on gender equality and low-income women. She's also an advisor to the UN Women and a member of the UN Committee for Development Policy. She's an active researcher, which is usually what happens with academics. We never stop thinking, we never stop working. Our brains work even after our retirement. And she's active researcher and publishing on fiscal policy, gender equality, human rights, and of course, interacting with feminist scholars in Scotland as a visiting professor in the Women in Scotland's Economy Research Group at Glasgow Caledonian. She's going to be talking today on the work of the Commission for a Gender Equal Economy with a focus on the fairness in the division of paid and unpaid work. I can just remind you before I hand over to Diane that you can put your questions on the chat, in the chat box, or if you want to come on mic, put there the WTS want to speak, and I will moderating that discussion after Diane's presentation. Diane, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me and asking me to talk on the topic of fair economy. I'm sure you'll come from a range of different disciplines, a range of different countries. For some of you, this may be a topic that's close to what you're researching on. For others of you, it doesn't perhaps seem to intersect at all. But on the other hand, you all living in economies, in the UK economy, in the economy perhaps of another country that you come from, and you're all affected in some way or other by how fair or unfair the economy is. So I start off with the issue of what is fair? What do we mean by fair? There was an article in the Sunday newspaper, The Observer, this Sunday, where one of their correspondents suggested that fairness means that no one should receive more than their due desert, and that injustices arising from undeserved good and bad luck should be corrected. He suggests that the UK has become an increasingly less fair country over the last 40 years. So how can we assess this claim? Does data on inequalities support this claim? How is fairness related to the underlying structure of the economy? I'm going to draw on some of my recent research on inequalities and my work with the Women's Budget Group and its Commission on a Gender Equal Economy to try and explore these questions. So let's start with income inequalities in the UK. Inequality in disposable household income, that's after direct taxes and transfers, is often measured by something called the Gini coefficient, where 0 represents perfect equality, while 1 implies that all income goes to a single household. This will be familiar to all of those of you who are economists, but perhaps not to other people. The Gini coefficient in the UK was 0.35 in 2016. Is this fair or not? On this measure, income inequality in the UK is less than in the USA, but one of the highest in Europe. And it rose steeply in the 1980s, but not that much change from the early 90s to 2016. But this measure, the Gini coefficient, doesn't really capture the vastly diverging fortunes of the richest and the poorest. It's a number that you have to keep explaining and try to contextualize. It doesn't speak directly to people. Whereas the share of UK income going to the 1% richest households might, and this has risen sharply through the 1990s to 8% in 2017. And it's this last kind of measure, the share of income going to the richest households, that was at the core of Piketty's best-selling book on inequalities. But we might ask, is this fair? Is it fair or not that the 1% richest households get 8% of the national income? Maybe it's the result of their hard work. On these slides, by the way, I'll indicate what the data sources are, and there's slides at the end giving the detail of the data sources, and this will be posted on the website, so you can look at it there if you want to look at the sources. Perhaps pay inequalities are easier to understand directly. If you look at pay inequalities between the rich and the poor, in 2017, the average pay of CEOs of FTSE, the Financial Times, the Stock Exchange Index, 100 big companies in the UK, was 145 times the pay of the average worker, up from 47 times in 1998. So a big increase in the average pay of CEOs compared with the pay of the average worker. But maybe the productivity of the CEOs is vastly increased. Household earnings of the poorest have stagnated, but maybe the productivity of the poorest has not increased. There's evidence for the G20 countries that the combined labour share of low and middle skilled labour fell by more than 10 percentage points from 1995 to 2009, while for highly skilled labour, it rose by more than 5 percentage points in what the IMF calls the emerging G20 countries like India and China, and by 10 percentage points in the so-called advanced G20 countries like UK and USA. So a big divergence there. But what does skill mean? What about the unrecognized tacit skills of essential workers who are very, very often among these lowest paid? But maybe it's power and not productivity that determines pay. We can also look at pay inequalities in terms of gender and race. In the UK, the gap between male and female hourly earnings had been falling, but progress has stalled, and the gap was still 18% in 2018. But maybe this is because women choose to have children. A study found that gender gaps in employment, working hours, and wages really open up after workers become parents. Many more mothers than fathers stop paid work altogether or switch to part-time paid work while taking on the majority of the childcare. And this has a long-lasting cumulative impact on women's hourly wages well into the future. The median hourly pay of most minority ethnic groups was lower than of white British people in 2009. And tests of applications sent to employers show that there continues to be systematic racial discrimination within the labour market across ethnicities. These are the kinds of studies some of you may be familiar with, where applications are sent to employers with different names on them, names that might signify to employers membership of different ethnic groups. And then they see what difference it makes if you have a name on the application that the employer takes to be that of a white British person, or that the employer takes to be that of a member of a minority ethnic group. Let's turn to wealth now, wealth inequalities. Again, I'm using data from the UK to illustrate this, but if you want to know more about this for other countries, again, the work of Thomas Piketty and his colleagues has got a wealth of information. So wealth in this sense comprises net property wealth, private pension wealth, and net financial wealth. And in the UK, the distribution of wealth between households is almost twice as high. The Gini coefficient of the distribution of wealth between households is almost twice as high as for income. So wealth is a lot more unequally distributed than income. There's a gender gap. The median total net wealth of women was 13% lower than for men. There also is a race and ethnicity gap. The median total wealth for all households in Great Britain, you see the figure there, to 186,600, but ranging from as low as 34,000 among those with a household head from the Black African group to 314,000 for the white British group. These ethnic categories, by the way, that I'm using are those that are used in the ONS census and other data collected by the ONS, the Office of National Statistics, where there are about 17 different categories into which you can allocate yourself. If we look at the extent of the concentration of wealth among the rich, it's the adults in the top 10% who accounted for 49% of wealth in this period 2012-2014, with the top 1% alone owning 14%. Is this fair or unfair? Maybe the rich are more thrifty or make better investments than the rest of us. It's also interesting, especially in the context of COVID-19, to look at health and economic inequalities. Again, I'm using UK data. Inequalities in life expectancy widened between 2010 and 2020. Poorer communities, women, and those living in the north of England have experienced little or no improvement since 2010. You probably all know that in spring 2020, the age-adjusted COVID-19 death rates in the most deprived tenth of areas in the UK were more than double those in the least deprived areas. And people in the bottom 3 deciles of the income distribution are 50% more likely to have a pre-existing illness that put them at heightened risk than people in the top 2 deciles. And there have been much larger health impacts on minority ethnic groups relative to white people, which cannot be reduced to differences in age and location. So is this evidence of unfairness in life chances related to where people are positioned in the economy? But maybe it's a result of certain groups of people choosing unhealthy lifestyles. I should say, though, that the latest update from Professor Marmot and his colleagues, who are regularly looking at health inequalities in the UK, have concluded that it's structural racism. That means minority ethnic groups suffer from disadvantage in each of the social determinants of health. But clearly there are people in this country who don't believe that structural racism exists. And so data like this is by no means going to, by itself, conclude the argument. There have also inequalities in the unpaid economy, which have been intensifying during the COVID epidemic. And by the unpaid economy, I mean the economy in which people work for free, taking care of their families, taking care of their children, each other, their elderly parents, volunteering in the community. So feminist economists in particular have emphasized that we shouldn't think of the economy as simply the market-oriented, the paid economy. We should also recognize there's an unpaid economy in which a lot of work is done and which is a very important contribution both to current well-being and to future economic growth. So the evidence here is that both mothers and fathers in heterosexual couples in the UK with school-aged children substantially increased the time spent on unpaid care. But more was done by mothers, even if they had a paid job. This increase is, of course, linked to the lockdowns last year, during which schools were closed. Mothers were more likely to have lost their jobs, either temporarily or permanently, than fathers. And it's women with the lowest levels of education that were at the most disadvantaged in terms of loss of employment. Childcare, though, isn't the only important form of unpaid care. There are unpaid carers who look after adults, frail elderly adults or adults with severe disabilities. and their numbers increased in 2020 by 4.5 million to over 13.6 million. Nearly 58% of these unpaid carers are women, and nearly 3 million of them combine paid work with this unpaid care, often for elderly relatives. A survey of these carers, almost 6,000 carers in October 2020, found that nearly 2/3 had no respite anymore from their caring responsibilities. 3/4 reported feeling exhausted and worn out. 2/3 said their mental health had worsened, and 11% reported they'd had to reduce their hours of paid work to manage their caring responsibilities, and 9% had given up paid work because of caring. And of course, while it's possible to argue, as some people do, that, well, women choose to have children, so that's not really unfair if they get penalized in the labor market as a result, it's harder to argue that people choose to have frail elderly parents who need their care. And I think this data is the kind of data that is perhaps more convincing to people who are inclined to think that a lot of inequalities and a lot of are not really unfair. They're due to the choices that people make. There are regional inequalities in the UK, as in most countries, but the UK is the most interregionally unequal, large, high-income country. And in the period just before COVID-19, whilst the London region was the richest region of Europe, the UK also had 6 of the 10 poorest regions. And the gap was widening. The per capita income in London was still 43% above the national average, compared with 18% above in 1985. In England, the greatest concentration of the most deprived neighbourhoods is in the north. But maybe it's the people in the north are less productive, and so that's why their incomes are lower. I've shared a lot of data from statistics, from economic and sociological studies, and from the Office of National Statistics. Now let me turn to a recent study on attitudes to inequality in Britain in 2020. That was in, I think, the autumn of last year. It found that inequalities between more and less deprived areas, along with disparities in income and wealth, are seen as the most serious type of inequality in Britain. And while 67% say it would be a problem if the gap in incomes between white people and ethnic minorities grew as a result of the coronavirus crisis, 24% said they wouldn't consider this a problem. Half of them, people surveyed, said that discrimination helps to explain why Black people have lower earnings, but 13% think it's a result of Black people lacking motivation or willpower. And this last finding was the most concerning for me, that the public are least concerned about income inequality between women and men getting worse. And there's a lot of evidence that it's likely to be getting worse. 32% actively say they would not consider this a problem. So we can see there's a range of attitudes to inequality in Britain and a range of views about what's fair and unfair. More information from this survey. 47% said that an individual's performance at work is important in determining whether they lost their job at this time, in other words, during the COVID epidemic, compared with 31% who said luck is an important factor. So even in the depths of the COVID-19 crisis, there were still people who thought, a lot of people, almost half, that an individual's performance at work is the important thing in determining whether they lost their job, rather than bad luck. 55% do think that the crisis means there's more need for the government to take measures to reduce differences in income levels, compared with 15% who disagree. And here, as on many of the other issues, there's a difference in opinion between voters for the two main political parties in England, with Conservative voters far less likely than Labour voters to agree that there's need for the government to take measures. The government, of course, says it is going to take measures to, quote, level up, but the focus is very much on regional inequalities and not the other kinds of inequalities that I've drawn to your attention. Structural determinants of inequality. This is where we as social scientists have an important role to play. Structural determinants are not immediately visible and they can't be reduced to individual choices, but so often inequalities and whether something is fair or not are interpreted as a result of individual choices. Among the, we could have a whole day on structural determinants of inequality. I'm just going to draw attention to some key ones. So among the structural determinants of the inequalities that I've been reporting on is the increasing power of large corporations, the falling power of workers, laws that privilege commercial rights, the rights to buy and sell and make a profit, over economic and social rights as set out in international human rights treaties, social norms and practices, including violence, that lead to unpaid work caring for families being primarily women's responsibility, and social norms and practices, including violence, that limit the life chances of people from ethnic minorities. And I think this role of violence in gender inequality and racial inequality in the economy is actually an under-researched topic. So anybody who's looking, I know most of you already chosen your research topics, anybody who's looking for research topics, I think this is definitely an issue that merits more consideration. The role of violence, both actual and threatened, both physical and psychological in economic inequalities. Just a snapshot of the huge concentration of economic power that there is in the UK in the hands of big companies. So in the period just prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, 6 energy companies had 82% of the retail energy market, 4 supermarkets had 69% of the grocery sales, 5 banks had 85% of retail bank accounts, 4 mobile phone companies had 89% of customers. A few firms like Carillion had a very high proportion of the outsourced contracts to deliver publicly funded services. Facebook had 74% of the market for social networks. Amazon was responsible for about 80% of online sales of books, and Google enjoyed 90% of the search engine market. You might say, is this concentration of economic power fair? I mean, maybe it's the result of these companies just being very productive, very innovative, and outcompeting the others. But on the other hand, there is a long-standing strand in economic theory that questions the growth of this kind of monopoly power and suggests that it's neither fair nor, in the long run, efficient. And there's a lot more data I could give you about the concentration of economic power. But let's turn to the opposite side of that coin, the falling power of workers, the huge increase in the prevalence of precarious work. So prior to COVID-19, 3.7 million people in the UK workforce were in insecure work, 1 in 9 of the workforce. This includes 20% of those classed as occupying elementary roles, including kitchen assistants, security guards, and farm workers, 17% of those in caring and leisure roles, 19% of those working in skilled trades, and Black workers, women, and disabled workers were all disproportionately represented in insecure work. During COVID itself, there's been a growth of what's called fire and rehire tactics, so that nearly 1 in 10 workers in Britain have been told to reapply for their jobs on worse terms and conditions since the first lockdown in March 2020. In some European countries, this would not be legal, but it is legal to do this in the UK, a reflection of how the rights of workers have deteriorated over the last 40 years. So we might ask, is the labour market fair? So I've raised a lot of questions about what's fair and what's not fair to convey that it's not a straightforward question, and that no matter what kind of data one produces about inequalities, it can always be challenged by people who think that those inequalities are not the result of unfair processes, but are the result of hard work, innovation, and choices to do things like have children. And we can perhaps take up some of those issues in the discussion. So finally, I want to talk to the issue of how can we create a fairer economy? Redistribution is an obvious answer. Redistribution through more progressive taxation and higher public expenditure on social security and public services, delivered in ways that are consistent with human dignity and are responsive to people's needs. And I'd add, by public sector or not-for-profit companies, not outsourced to profit-driven businesses that reduce the quality of services and jobs. Because certainly what we have in the UK and in quite a lot of countries now is, although public expenditure may be quite high, the actual delivery of public services is outsourced to profit-driven businesses. We've had this last few weeks a good example of the way that that can reduce the quality of services, with the evidence in a legal case about how water companies have been discharging sewage into the sea and into rivers and streams because it's cheaper to do that than to take the measures to properly process it. So although, so it's very important to think about how public services actually delivered, not only what's spent on them. But more recently in the discussion has been introduced this concept of pre-distribution. And there are different ways of defining this. Thomas Piketty and his colleagues in Paris have defined it one way. The IMF have looked at this and defined it in a slightly different way. I've argued in a paper that's forthcoming in an edited collection of how to make more equal and sustainable economies post-COVID. I've argued that the concept of pre-distribution that I find most useful is one that focuses on changing the balance between commercial rights and economic and social rights. In other words, underpinning the market processes and other social processes that are giving rise to inequalities is an imbalance between commercial rights and economic and social rights. And this needs to be remedied through new laws on competition, corporate governance, reporting on gender pay gaps and race and ethnicity pay gaps, strengthened labour rights, and strengthened rights to social security and rights to public services such as health and education. So I think it's important not only to look at what can be done through tax and spend to redistribute the income and wealth that arises out of the operation of the economy, but also to look at pre-distribution, to look at the rights to resources and how to use them that structures the economy, in which I've argued in this forthcoming paper has become unfair. Another take on how we can create a fairer economy that I've been involved in is this Women's Budget Group Commission on a Gender Equal Economy, which worked in 2019 and 2020 and produced its report last year. And that has a wider view and calls for a transition to a caring economy that prioritizes equality in well-being. So that care, rather than financial targets, should take priority for all businesses, large or small, whether they're owned by shareholders, employees, or members of cooperatives, and for all levels of government, local, regional, national, and all kinds of public agencies, and for all non-governmental organizations and community groups. In a caring economy, everybody would give and receive care on the basis of their capacities and needs, supported by well-resourced, high-quality public care services and time off from paid work, including a shorter working week. And this would be done with a focus, as I said, on well-being rather than economic growth or money, income, and wealth. And indeed, there are some moves in this direction in Scotland. In this report, 8 practical steps are identified, including policies at local, regional, national, and international level. And so if you want to find out more about that, do read the report, which is available online. But I think I've talked quite long enough now. So I wanted to finish by asking, what are your concerns and ideas? How, if at all, does your research topic impinge on the question of a fair economy? Do you think the economy operates unfairly for you? What are your ideas on how to make the economy fairer? And how can academic research be used to promote ideas and policies for a fair economy in wider society? Thank you. Oh, these are the references. There are 3 slides with references, which will get posted at the end.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Diane. We can open the floor to questions. You can either put them on the chat or come on the mic.
Okay.
Until everybody put their question in the chat, I can take chair's privilege.
Sure.
I think for me, the most concerning statistic you've demonstrated throughout the presentation was that there is a large proportion of individuals that they do not consider, especially the gender pay gap, an issue. And, you know, I was wondering whether you can tell us whether you have made any thoughts around the underlying factors of that. You know, what is the thinking process of those individuals? Is it education? What is it?
I think a lot of people think that gender inequality and racial inequality too is a matter of ending formal discrimination. And so they say, well, there's an Equal Pay Act. There is no formal discrimination. You know, it's not like 50 years ago when women couldn't get loans in their own right, when they were barred from certain jobs after they were married. There's formal equality now. And that's what they think of as that would be a problem if there weren't formal legal equality. But the issue of substantive equality, the equalities in both opportunities and in outcomes, is seen as secondary to that, and is something that's more explained by people's choices. So then when you point out, actually, there isn't a gender gap in educational achievement, or if there is, it's actually the women and girls are doing better than men and boys, but you've still got this big gap in pay and other indicators in the economy. That's when people say, well, it's because women choose to have children. And then that's when you have to start interrogating, what does you mean by choice? In what sense is this a choice? Under in what circumstances do women make these choices? Don't fathers also choose to have children? So why is it's seen as, well, it's not a problem because women choose to have children, it's been their choice. And so then that's it. So, well, yes, fathers do choose to have children, but actually, you know, women are better at taking care of babies than men are. And so that's, I think, where you come into the anthropological and sociological research about what shapes those ideas about who is better or who should look after babies or who is better at looking after babies. But also, interestingly, no time to talk about this in my presentation, but there is a whole group of younger men who very much want to take care of their children and who respond to surveys saying that, well, they would like to be able to have more time taking care of their children, but the way their jobs are designed doesn't make that easy. Employers expect men are going to be, quote, full-time workers or even more than full-time workers. And if you ask for time off for parental leave or for looking after your sick child, this is seen by some employers as evidence that you're not really committed fully to the job. So there are those kinds of issues to deal with. There's both the attitudes of men and women, but there's also the attitudes of employers and the way they design jobs that are going to build in this pressure for it to be women to quit work or go part-time and take care of the children. And of course, if you're in a family, especially a lower income family, faced with this choice, and you're in a situation at the moment where the family will lose more if the father quits, say it's a mother and father family, if the father quits the labor market, then if the mother quits the labor market, then you don't really have much choice if you're going to be able to cover your rent and your groceries and your household bills. So I think that leads us into that conversation about what do we mean by choice, which is easier to, can't explore all that in a survey. We did some focus groups for this commission that I chaired on a gender equal economy, when one could start to explore some of those issues in a more nuanced way. And then people's views became a bit more nuanced.
I think my question gave the opportunity to everybody to reflect a bit, and we've got quite a few questions now. So I'll take them as they come in. Jennifer asks, how much do you think it depends on a willingness of a government to tackle these issues? And of course, William added to that, and what would motivate governments, policymakers, to make changes?
Almost every government does have some kind of policy about this. What matters is the difference in degree. So they all have policies which either affect pre-distribution, the structure of rights, and there have been changes, big changes in those in the UK, and you can compare across countries and see that the structure of labour rights and of the rights of businesses that we have in the UK is not the same as it is in Germany, for instance. It's not the same as it is in Sweden, but nevertheless, those rights are matters of law. So in the end, it's the government who is structuring that. And every government has some kind of, and they may structure it in ways that lead to more inequality, not less. I mean, arguably in the UK, over the last 40 years, that's what happened. Those rights have been restructured in ways that lead to less inequality. In order to reduce inequality, again, the governments can legislate to change the rights, and they can also use taxation and spending on public services and social security. And all governments in Europe do that, and in North America and Japan. But the way they do it and the extent to which they do it varies tremendously. But that can change. You can see the change in the USA when the Biden administration came in and starts announcing that it wants to both restructure these underlying rights to strengthen labor rights and to strengthen the anti-monopoly policies, and also to spend money on childcare, to spend more money on healthcare, to improve the income transfer payments to low income families. And even in this country, where we certainly don't have that, and we're probably going to see a reduction in the income transfers going to low-income families when we have the budget in the autumn, the government still wants to talk about equality, but it's equality it calls levelling up. And it's an equality which is based on looking at the per capita income and productivity of different regions and indeed different towns. But then the way the government in the UK government's not at all the same as Scotland and Wales, but the way they want to address that is by having competitions where towns can bid against one another for a little pot of money, which they can then use to do some infrastructural development in their town, improve the high street, or the central government will allocate big projects to these various towns, but not directly, not using indicators of deprivation to decide where to put the money. The money that's been allocated to towns so far seems to have been allocated to those towns which have returned a Conservative MP at the last election, and not to those towns where the deprivation indices are worse. The multiple deprivation indices are worse. So I think no government wants to say we don't care about inequality, but the way they address inequality and what they consider to be inequality, nobody will say we want to be unfair, but how they will interpret fairness is very, very different, and what measures they will use to try and make things fairer will be very different.
Diane, in your answer, you mentioned Sweden, and we've got Sharon asking to comment on whether you think the idea of a universal income, such as the one they have in Sweden, might help to secure income security and well-being for everyone.
We had a lot of discussion of this in the commission that I chaired on a gender equal economy, which drew on representatives from academia, from trade unions, from business, from a variety of NGOs, and consulted with the academics, officials, politicians in the 4 countries of the UK. In the end, we could not come to a consensus on this. Some people think that this would be a very good policy and a very good way forward. Others are much more cautious and say, well, the problem is it would never be high enough. We found that the disability rights organizations were very skeptical about this policy, because they said, well, if it replaces what we've already got, we're concerned about it, because if it's universal and the same for everybody, it won't take into account the different needs and the higher needs of people with severe disabilities who need a larger income in order to enjoy the same kind of mobility, for instance, as the rest of us. There were also feminists on both sides of the argument, some who thought, yes, this would be a great idea, but others who thought, well, a bit wary about that, because in the current circumstances, won't this put pressure on women to stay at home? Won't this reinforce the idea that it's mothers who should stay home and look after the children? Because look, now they're getting a basic income from the state. So in the end, we rather sat on the fence on this. And my own view is a lot depends on the context. A lot depends on what it's replacing. A lot depends on whether it is an alternative to improving investment in public services, or whether it's a complementary to improving investment in public services. So introducing basic income in Sweden, which has already got a very strong public sector with strong public services, a bit different from thinking about introducing basic income in a country like the USA, which hasn't. And I know there's big debate in the USA where a lot of progressive people are rather skeptical about the idea of a basic income. And also people who are working on racial inequality and with young Black men, for instance, say what young Black men want is decent jobs, not an income like a basic income. So I do think a lot depends on the particular circumstances and what goes along with a universal basic income. What does it replace? What's complementary to it? So I haven't come up with a general yes or no to that, and I would look at on a country by country basis.
And can I ask you to comment? Jack is saying that perhaps a universal basic income might enable a flexible mixed economy, markets and states. Would you think that would be a way of addressing the issue?
So much depends on what the level of the basic income is. Is it a basic income, as its first proponents, like Philip van Parijs, or many years ago, a philosopher who propounded basic income? It should be enough that you could live on it. And then if you choose to spend your time being an artist or surfing, that was up to you. But it should be enough that you can live on it. But if you can live on it, then of course it will put a floor underneath the labor market. It will mean nobody will want to do a job that pays less than the basic income unless they want to have more money. But there won't be the same compulsion. On the other hand, you can do that with minimum wages. So minimum wages would also put, and better labor rights, that floor under the labor market. I know there are people who argue for this on the grounds, for instance, it would allow for a more flexible labor market, but actually good unemployment benefits and good active labor market policies that provide retraining for workers would also do that. So again, I think it's a lot of the context in which you're introducing the basic income and what rights there are that labor has, what rights there are that capital has. But the question of how are you going to fund it to make it a basic income that people can live on, I think is still the conundrum. Of course, there's also the issue, basic income for whom? Is this just a basic income for citizens? Is it a basic income for everybody who lives in a country? There are lots of knotty ethical questions there as well.
Olivia is bridging your presentation today with the topic we're going to be discussing tomorrow around the climate crisis.
Yeah.
And she's asking you whether you can add or comments on her statement, which is that a caring economy, and degrowth, which is required to address the climate crisis, are kind of linked. So how do you see that?
Yes, we certainly argued on the Commission that moving towards a caring economy focused on well-being would also help to address the climate crisis, because this is caring for one another, but also caring for the planet and downgrading the drive for growth. We didn't completely embrace degrowth. I personally think this is a bit of a problematic concept. When I talk to colleagues in Asia and Africa about degrowth, not so sure. It's okay for you rich people in Northern Europe. But I certainly think downgrading economic growth as an objective and making other objectives more important. And also asking what's going to grow. We want some things to grow. We want care services to grow. We want affordable public transport to grow. We want houses that are well insulated and energy efficient to grow. But a lot of other things we don't want to grow. We want them to decline. And the problem with the GDP growth as an objective, it blurs all that distinction, and the growth of any one thing is as good as the growth of anything else. It's only the market price that weights them. And also, I should say that inequality is also very linked to the issue of the climate crisis. But of course, the carbon footprint of the rich is much higher than the carbon footprint of the poor.
I think everybody is putting very kind words around your presentation in the chat. And Tom is doing research around the area, and he's looking at access to voting for different groups and which electorate practices shape political participation. So he wants you to comment whether this idea can go beyond policies that promote a fair economy, and we could be discussing policies that allow people to shape a fair economy that is sensitive to their needs.
To what a fair economy? To shape it.
To shape a fair, yes.
Yes, and we might say that in order to do that, we also need to have a fair voting system. And we don't have a fair voting system in quite a lot of countries. And so I'd be interested to know, what the political science researchers among you think. Is there a discussion in political science about fair voting systems? Because different voting systems give a voice, a bigger voice to certain people. And in this country at the moment, there is actually an attempt to what I would call voter suppression, to bring in requirements for IDs and so forth in a way that we've never had before, which since we don't have ID cards, this will definitely make it harder to vote for people who don't have passports or driving licenses. And that, to me, would be an unfair electoral system. But of course, again, with electoral systems, there are all kinds of issues about what's fair and not. And the issue of how effective a voice you can have. So things like citizens' juries, citizens' assemblies, and the way that you can have a political voice on issues like fairness, which isn't simply through the ballot box, is also very important, because it's those things like citizens' juries and citizens' assemblies, where there's a discursive practice, where there's a dialogue, where you have some chance also of shifting the attitudes of your fellow citizens, many of whom think it's actually not really that unfair.
We are in an academic environment, and we all work within universities, and Beth's comment is bringing this discussion home. And what he's saying is that it's important within universities and political parties. At the moment, it feels very hard to talk about sex-based material reality behind the pay gap and other professional hurdles, especially around childbearing and care work, because it usually gets mixed up with very heated debates around gender identity. And there is also this, violence as one mechanism of keeping women in certain economic roles in regard to single-sex spaces. And she's asking, how can universities improve the spaces where these issues can be discussed in ways that can be helpful to everybody?
Well, I know this has been a big issue at Essex recently. So I know and I've not been there, not been part of the discussions, but I would say I think respect is absolutely critical. You need to be respectful of those who have somewhat different views, who share some views, particularly because they share some views, but they differ on other views, and it's important to be respectful. And I think the way that social media oversimplifies and polarizes is not helpful for trying to work through any of those issues, these intersectional issues about different kinds of inequalities, different kinds of unfairness, how they intersect with one another, and how we can try and work together to resolve those. It's not an easy thing, but I think we have to be respectful of one another.
And I think almost a parallel question is from Sue. How do you tackle mainstream media, which demonize the poor as lazy and unmotivated?
Yes, this is a really, really important, and I actually think it's the popular newspapers and some TV programs that in the UK in particular have really sort of demonized the benefit scroungers. So I think there are a number of strategies, of course, telling counter stories. So you try and get a different set of stories out. And one of the most important, of course, is actually how so many people who are poor, whose children are hungry, they have got a paid job. It's just that their paid job is paying them so little, it's not possible for them to feed their children. Getting footballers to have campaigns around these issues, like Marcus, to show, tell his own story, to have a counter narrative to this demonization of the poor people as scroungers who don't want to work. And I think we of course in academic life we have a role to play in that, in terms of crunching the numbers that show this, that show, well, what they showed on this TV program was not typical at all, and they picked out selectively certain issues and dramatized them. But if you look at the data, they'll show that wasn't typical. But I also know that although numbers sometimes speak, good stories also speak. So we need that qualitative as well as quantitative evidence, if you like, fruits of our social science research to try and counteract those views about who the poor are and why they're poor.
I will pick up Felicity's question as the last question I'm going to be asking you, because it's at the core of my research agenda as well. And Felicity is talking about, multinational corporations and, the power that they have, and how that power has grown over the years, and whether we have reached the tipping point in terms of the power those multinationals have. And it will be very difficult for us to reclaim that power back and rebalance those rights, especially perhaps in the context of emerging and developing economies where the institutional frameworks are, characterized by voids, and they're not as strong as in developed economies.
Yes, it's not easy. I'd be the first to say that. But I do see a few more glimmers of hope than I did a couple of years ago. I think there is a bit more movement on the issue of taxation, taxation of international corporations and taxation of corporations, with the notion of rich countries agreeing, well, actually most countries agreeing to a minimum rate of corporation tax to try and halt the competition to have the lowest rate of corporation tax. There's a lot more that has to be done about tax avoidance mechanisms and tax evasion mechanisms, but I think the Biden administration has given a bit of a new impetus to that, so that those countries that were already arguing for this but not getting anywhere because of what in the UN we used to call the G1 when the US president was Trump, and now there's a little bit more movement on some of these things that people have been talking about. There's a little bit more movement on competition policy. I think the EU is taking, I wish we were still there, but that's too late now, but they're taking a strong line on competition policy with some of the big media companies, and some signs that the US government is trying to do that. There are people, I think, in most developing countries who would like to see more effective taxation and a reining in of the power of multinational corporations. Some of them are getting, you know, are more in government. Look at Argentina now, which is doing much more to try and tax the rich, tax big companies. But there are others. They don't, and as individual countries, particularly the least developed countries, I sat on a UN committee that was particularly concerned with them. By themselves, each government by itself has no chance. You can only do it if you have an international coalition and international agreements, because otherwise the multinationals will always pick them off one by one. So it's hard, but I think we shouldn't be over optimistic, but we should see there's a little more possibilities now than they perhaps were 2 years ago. And we should be pushing very hard for that kind of international agreement.
Thank you very much. I wish we had another hour at least here with the discussion and the very interesting, insightful comments from our students and the way you have responded to their comments. I would like to take this opportunity to thank you very much for, you know, an insightful presentation. Some very depressing statistics there, but a glimpse of hope, I think, towards the end. And I just want to extend our thanks on behalf of SeNSS for your contribution to our conference. Thank you very much, Diane.
You're very welcome. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, all of you. So sorry we couldn't actually be together in person. Maybe next year you will be able to be together in person.
Thank you very much.
Okay, bye. Bye.